take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. Nora Colby arrived at the cottage on the 3rd of December, in the late afternoon, when the Cotswolds light was doing what it always did at this hour in this season, turning the honey-coloured stone of every building, the particular amber of old beeswax, warm and slightly luminous, as though the stone were lit from within rather than from the low grey sky above it. She had not been here in 4 years. She had told herself it was the distance London to Chipping-Campden and then the further drive down the lane that most maps didn't bother to show, and that was partly true. It was also her mother's health and her own work and the reasonable accumulations of a life that made journeys like this one easy to defer. All of which was true, and none of which was the real reason. The real reason was that her grandmother had still been alive the last time she visited, and coming back now, in December, in the dark, with the key the solicitor had posted in a brown envelope, was a different kind of coming. She sat in the hire car at the end of the track for a moment, the cottage just visible through the bare winter hedge, the honeystone catching the last light. A chimney, 2 dark windows, the low iron gate with its familiar latch. She got out. The December air was immediate and absolute, the deep settled cold of old stone country, the cold that had been living in the walls and the ground since October and would stay until March, her breath visible in it, the lane very still. She took her bag and went to the gate. The path to the door was flat Cotswolds limestone, worn smooth in the centre by years of feet. She had walked this path as a child, the Christmases and the summers, the visits that had been the fixed points of her childhood while everything else shifted. As a young woman less frequently, but the cottage always exactly as she had left it. Her grandmother always exactly as she had left her. And then, gradually, less and less until the 4 years that she had not intended and had not corrected and now could not. She stopped on the path and let the cottage be what it was. Honeystone, low roof, the Virginia creeper on the east wall stripped bare, the dry tendrils dark against the stone. The front garden cut back for winter, the roses pruned and tied, the lavender hedge along the path grey and still. Someone had done this. The solicitor had mentioned a neighbour, a woman in the village who had been quietly looking after things since August. The small kindnesses of a village that looked after its own. The cottage was hers now. She had read this in the solicitor's letter and had not yet absorbed it into the part of herself that felt things rather than simply understood them. The garden, the kitchen, the contents of every room, all of it hers now, in a way that did not feel like having something, but like being responsible for something, which was not the same thing at all. She went to the door. The key was old made to last, and lasting. It had sat on her London kitchen counter for 2 weeks after the brown envelope arrived. She had looked at it every morning and not gone. And then one Tuesday she had understood that looking at it was not the same as going, and she had booked the hire car. The lock opened smoothly. Someone had oiled it. She pushed the door, and it swung inward with the same slight creak it had always made, the voice of old wood on old hinges, the sound that had been part of what the word cottage meant to her for as long as she could remember. The smell of the cottage reached her before she stepped inside. She had prepared herself for this, had told herself she was ready. She was not ready. lavender water and wood smoke and old books, and something underneath both that was simply the smell of her grandmother and this house combined over 40 years of living. The smell of her grandmother in the past tense, permanent now, unchanging, because there was no one left to add to it. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went in. The hallway was exactly as she remembered it. The narrow hall, the low ceiling, the flagstone floor, the coat hooks on the right, her grandmother's coat still there, the dark wool, the familiar shapes, the walking stick in the corner, the small mirror above the hall table, the shallow drawer in the hall table that had always stuck and that contained, without question, the particular miscellany that shallow drawers in hall tables always contained: rubber bands, old receipts, a small torch, something long expired. She set her bag at the foot of the stairs. The cottage was cold, the cold of a house unheated for months, settled into everything, not damp, simply the deep cold of a space that had not been inhabited since August and knew it. She went into the sitting room. Everything in the sitting room was as it had always been. This was the thing about this cottage. Her grandmother had not been a person who changed things without reason, and she had found very few reasons in 40 years. The same furniture in the same positions, the thick wall curtains, dark blue, exactly long enough to reach the sill, the bookshelf along the east wall, the books in their own undecipherable order, the fireplace, stone, deep, the grate cleared but not laid, the coal scuttle still half full, the log basket stacked the neighbour's work, the mantelpiece, the clock, the 2 photographs, the china shepherd her grandmother had always loved and Nora had always found slightly sinister. She went to the mantelpiece. The photographs her grandmother as a young woman, the face familiar and not, 40 years of change between the image and the person she had known, and herself at perhaps 8 years old, standing in the back garden squinting into summer sun, holding something she could not make out, entirely absorbed. Her grandmother had kept this photograph on this mantelpiece for however many years since it was taken. Nora looked at the child in it, thought about the woman who had looked at it from the armchair by the window through all the years of this cottage. She thought, "You were watching me all along." She went through the house room by room. The small study, her grandmother's desk by the window, papers in orderly piles, a pen in the holder. On the wall above the desk, the map of the Cotswolds that had been there since the year Nora was born, the walking routes marked on it in pencil, her grandmother's routes. The lines faded now to near invisibility, but there, if you looked, Nora traced one route with her finger. The circular walk she had done with her grandmother many times, from the village to the top of the hill, down through the beech wood, back along the stream. She had done this walk in spring and summer, and once in early snow that had turned the beechwood entirely white and absolutely silent. Her grandmother had walked ahead of her, the walking stick, the particular pace, neither hurrying nor slow. She had not thought about that walk in years. She thought about it now, standing in the study with her finger on the faded pencil line, the cottage cold and quiet around her. Upstairs, the 2 bedrooms, her grandmother's room she looked into and did not enter. Not yet. The bed made with the precision of someone who had made it the same way every morning for 40 years. The curtains drawn as they had been left on the last morning. She pulled the door almost closed. The spare room, her room, always. The small room at the back of the house. The window looking out over the garden and the field beyond. The single bed with its patchwork quilt. the chest of drawers, the rag rug on the floor beside the bed. She sat on the bed, the patchwork quilt under her hands. She knew every square. That one from a dress of her grandmother's. That one from old curtains that had been in this room before these curtains. The dark red square in the corner from something older, before Nora had been here to know its origin. She sat with her hands on the quilt and looked out at the December garden. The apple tree leafless, the holly hedge along the back wall, the berries very red against the grey sky, the field beyond the wall white with the first hard frost of December, everything very still. She thought, I should have come sooner. She had been thinking this since August. She thought it again now, without expectation of resolution. It was not a thought that resolved, simply one that needed to be had. She had been saving the kitchen. She understood this as she came back downstairs, that she had been going through the rooms in a particular order, the kitchen last. Not deliberately, simply the way the rooms had arranged themselves in her mind, the kitchen requiring its own moment. The kitchen had been her grandmother's room. Not exclusively, she had used all the rooms with equal ownership, had sat in the sitting room and worked at the study desk and slept in the bedroom. But the kitchen had been hers in a more specific way, the way certain rooms became a person's through occupation rather than simply through use. The room she had come to every morning, the room where the days had been organized and fed, the room Nora had spent the most hours of her childhood visits watching from the table, the chair pulled up close to the range, her grandmother moving between the worktop and the stove with the particular efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that the doing of it required no thought. She stood at the kitchen doorway and looked. The kitchen was warm, not from heating the cottage, had been cold through and through. No one had turned it on. But the kitchen was warmer than the other rooms. The warmth of stone that had held years of cooking heat absorbed it slowly over decades until even in December, months after the last meal had been made here, the room held a different temperature from the rest of the house. The warmth of a room that had been well used for a very long time. She stepped in. The range against the north wall, old, black iron, the kind of range that was the heart of a country kitchen. Not burning now, had not been burning since August, but there, in its place, entirely itself. The kitchen table, scrubbed pale wood, the grain rising from many scrubbings. 4 mismatched chairs they had never matched. These chairs had always been the collection that ended up around this table because they were approximately the right height, and there were 4 of them. She sat in the chair at the end nearest the range. Her chair, or what she had always thought of as her chair, the one whose back she had leaned against as a child watching her grandmother work, the particular angle of the legs, the slight unevenness in the seat from years of use, the chair that had always been here when she sat in it. She sat and looked at the kitchen, the shelves above the worktop, the pans on the rail below, their bottoms darkened from years of heat, the jars of dried herbs above, labeled in her grandmother's handwriting, slightly faded, rosemary, thyme, sage, bay. The names in the same forward-leaning script she had known all her life on birthday cards, on the occasional letters, now on jar labels in a cold kitchen in December. The spice rack beside the window. Her grandmother had made it herself from offcuts of wood, dark green paint, alphabetical order maintained for as long as Nora had been old enough to notice. Allspice at the left, turmeric at the right. Everything between in its place. She thought, nothing has been moved. She looked at the kitchen again with this, not the pans, not the jars, not the chairs, nothing. Everything exactly where it had been 4 years ago, when she had stood here watching her grandmother make the particular chicken dish she had been requesting since childhood. Everything in its place, as though the kitchen had been left ready for the next meal, as though nothing had ended. She sat with this for a moment. Not the grief of it, the grief was there but not pressing. Simply the particular quality of a space that had been a person and was now the record of a person. The kitchen as evidence. The kitchen as the accumulated physical proof of 40 years of mornings and meals and the specific daily practice of feeding people well. She lit the range. It took her a few minutes to remember the procedure, the damper, the kindling, the sequence her grandmother had shown her once and that she had helped with but never done entirely alone. The first attempt did not catch. The second caught slowly, the kindling taking, the small flame finding itself and beginning to grow. She stood before the range and watched it. The first heat coming off the iron, small at first, the range not yet warmed through, but present. The beginning of warmth in a cold kitchen. The kitchen beginning to wake into itself again after the months of cold and silence. She put the kettle on, the old kettle battered, the handle re-wrapped with cloth at some point, the lid slightly loose. She had drunk tea made from water boiled in this kettle more times than she could count. She set it on the hot plate and stood back and listened to the particular sounds of the range, finding its rhythm, the ticking of metal warming, the small adjustments of heat. Outside, the December evening completed itself, the last of the light going from the sky above the garden, the Cotswolds dark arriving with the thoroughness of winter dark in the countryside, not the ambient orange of a city that never went fully dark, but the real thing. The dark of fields and dry stone walls and bare hedgerows and the winter sky, deep and patient and without apology. She made her tea and sat at the table with it in both hands, the range settling into its work behind her, the kitchen warming slowly, degree by degree, the stone taking the heat and beginning to give it back, the room shifting from the cold it had been into the warm kitchen it had always been. She looked at the worktop, at the cookbooks stacked at one end of it, 3 of them, the familiar spines. The large one with the blue spine her grandmother had bought when she first moved here. The smaller green one, a gift, a name written inside that Nora could not remember. And at the end, the thin one with no spine, text the notebook. Her grandmother's recipe notebook. Not bought, but made a notebook. Her grandmother had filled herself over the years, the recipes she had made and refined and made again until they were exactly right, and then written down in the precise belief that a recipe worth making was worth recording. Nora had seen it consulted and added to, but had never read it herself, had never felt she should not, because her grandmother had said it was private, but because the notebook had always seemed to say so itself. She looked at it now from across the kitchen, the cover slightly worn, the cloth faded from a darker blue to the blue-grey it currently was. The good paper pages showing at the edges, not thin pages, the pages of something meant to last. She thought, I should look at it. She thought, not tonight. She made her supper from what she had brought. She had not intended to cook, had packed food that needed no cooking, the practical provisions of someone who had been sensible about the journey. But the range was going, and the kitchen was warm, and eating cold food at this table while the range burned felt wrong. She found a pan on the rail and made something simple, the kind of simple the kitchen asked for on a first evening. Nothing that required the herbs or the spice rack. Simply something hot, made with the range and the pan and the kitchen in their proper way. She ate at the table, the range ticking behind her, the window above the sink showing the dark garden, the bare apple tree, the frost on the field beyond the wall, the December night doing what December nights did. The kitchen entirely warm now, the stone giving back what the range had been giving it for the past 2 hours. She thought about all the meals made in this kitchen, the breakfasts and the dinners and the Christmas lunches and the Friday loaves, the things her grandmother had made for her, the chicken dish, the apple crumble from the garden tree, the bread baked every Friday morning, the smell of it through the cottage meeting her at the top of the stairs when she woke. She thought about the things she had not learned. The bread especially. She had watched it being made many times, had been taught by doing rather than by instruction, had helped with the kneading and the proving and the shaping, but she had not made it herself, had not needed to in London, had not thought to learn before it was too late to be taught. She looked at the notebook on the worktop. It will be in there. The bread and everything else. The chicken dish and the crumble and the things she had eaten 50 times and watched being made and never made herself, all of them written down in the precise belief that what was worth making was worth recording. She thought, tomorrow I will look at it. She thought this and found it was enough for tonight. After supper, she sat with her tea, the range burning steadily, the kitchen entirely warm, the December night pressing at the windows, very dark, very still. She turned off the main light and put the small lamp on the lamp that had always been on this table, the one her grandmother had used in the evenings. The light it cast amber and contained, making the kitchen feel like its own world. She sat in the lamplight and thought about her grandmother sitting in this same chair, about all the evenings, 40 years of evenings in this kitchen, in this lamplight, with this range, ticking. What had she thought about? What had she looked at the dark window, the garden, the same view Nora was looking at now? What had she been glad of? What had she wished had been different? She thought, I don't know enough about you. This was the particular grief, not the losing of someone, but the understanding, after they were gone, of all the things you had not asked. What her grandmother had wanted when she was young, what she had been afraid of, what she had been proudest of in the life she had made in this cottage, in this village, the interior of a person she had loved from the outside for 40 years. She looked at the notebook. In the lamplight, the blue-grey cover, the pages at the edges. She thought, the notebook is not answers. She thought, but it is something. It is the record of what she thought was worth keeping. That is something. She got up and wound the mantelpiece clock. She had found it run down when she went through the sitting room. Her grandmother had wound it every Sunday for 40 years. Nora wound it now on a Wednesday and listened to it begin to tick. The sound of it coming through from the sitting room into the kitchen, steady and familiar. She came back to the kitchen and stood for a moment at the range. The heat from it on her face and hands. The kitchen fully warm now, entirely itself the kitchen it had always been, requiring only a fire to be what it was. She thought, I am glad I came. She thought this simply and found it was entirely true, without qualification, without the weight of all the times she had not come. The coming was the thing that mattered. She was here. The range was going. The notebook was on the worktop, and tomorrow she would open it. She went to bed. Her old room, the patchwork quilt, the window with the frost on the field. She lay in the dark and listened to the cottage. The clock in the sitting room counting steadily. The range below, its warmth moving through the stone. The December silence outside, the silence of the Cotswolds in winter. The silence of a landscape settled into its cold with the patience of something that had been doing this every year for a very long time. She thought about the notebook, about getting up in the morning and coming down to the kitchen and opening it for the first time, about what she would find, the recipes she knew and the ones she didn't, her grandmother's handwriting on every page, the history of 40 years of cooking written down. She closed her eyes. The clock counted. The range held its warmth. The December night outside, very dark, very still, as it had always been, as it would be when she woke. She woke early. Not the anxious early of London mornings, the alarm and the immediate weight of the day's requirements pressing in before she was fully conscious. This was a different waking, the kind that came when a body had slept well and deeply in a quiet place and woke when it was ready rather than when it was required to. The room still dark, the December morning not yet arrived, the patchwork quilt warm around her, the clock from the sitting room below counting steadily. She lay still for a moment. The sounds of the cottage in the early morning, the clock, the faint tick of the range below, the particular silence of a house that had been standing in this landscape for long enough to have become part of it. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of a place entirely settled in itself. Outside, nothing, no traffic, no voices, no ambient noise of the kind that London generated so constantly that she had stopped hearing it years ago and now heard its absence very clearly. She got up and dressed in the cold of the room. The window showing the garden in the December pre-dawn, the frost on the field beyond the wall very white, the sky above it beginning, very faintly, to lighten at the eastern edge. The apple tree a dark shape, the holly hedge still with its red berries just visible. She went downstairs to the kitchen. The kitchen in the morning was different from the kitchen in the evening. The same room, the same table, the same range, the same shelves and jars and pans. But the light different, the quality of the space different. The evening kitchen had been amber and contained, the lamplight making a warm circle, and the rest of the room in shadow. The morning kitchen was beginning to receive the early December light through the east window above the sink grey at first, then slowly warmer as the sun came up over the Cotswolds fields and found its way through the bare trees and into the kitchen at the angle it had been coming in at every winter morning for 40 years. The range had held some warmth through the night. She fed it the procedure coming more naturally than the previous evening, her hands remembering the order of things. Ash out first, the tray emptied into the bucket beside it. Kindling, coal from the scuttle, the damper adjusted, the fire catching more readily than yesterday, the range itself warmer, easier to bring back. She put the kettle on and stood at the east window while it heated, the garden coming visible in the growing December light. The kitchen garden to the right of the path, the beds her grandmother had kept producing every year, the winter beds covered now with the brown remains of this year's growth, the bare canes of the raspberry patch along the wall, the herb beds closer to the kitchen door, the rosemary still green, the sage still green, the thyme low and woody, the things that lasted through winter, that did not need to be brought inside, that simply went on in the cold. She thought about the herbs in the jars on the shelf, her grandmother drying them every year from this garden, cutting and bundling and hanging and then grinding and jarring and labeling. The jar on the shelf above the worktop labeled rosemary, not bought from a shop, but taken from the bush outside the kitchen door, dried in this kitchen, ground in the small stone mortar on the worktop, put in the jar that had held rosemary before it, and before that, and going back through however many years. The kettle boiled. She made her tea, and stood at the table with it rather than sitting. Standing in the morning kitchen, the light coming in from the east window, the range ticking as it warmed, she looked at everything slowly. The particular, unhurried looking of a morning with nowhere to be and nothing required. She began to explore the kitchen properly on the second morning. The first morning she had simply been in it, had let it settle around her, had let herself be present in it without agenda. But by the second morning she was ready to look more carefully, the way you looked at something after you had spent enough time with it to see past your own first impressions. She started with the shelves above the worktop, the practical shelves, the jars of dried herbs she had already looked at, the tins of things, the tins labeled in her grandmother's handwriting, flour, sugar, oats. The biscuit tin she remembered round, painted with a country scene, slightly dented at one edge from a fall she had witnessed as a child, and that had been the occasion of the only time she had heard her grandmother say something sharp. She lifted the lid of the biscuit tin now. Empty. Of course, empty, cleaned and put away. The biscuits all eaten or disposed of in August. But the tin smelled of biscuits still. The particular sweet, slightly buttery smell of a tin that had held shortbread for many years. She held the tin and breathed it for a moment. She went through the other shelves. The preserving cupboard in the corner, her grandmother had preserved things every year from the garden and the hedgerows. The shelves inside the cupboard held the jars from this year's autumn work, jam, chutney, the dark quince paste she had always made from the quince tree in the garden's corner, the labels in the usual handwriting, blackberry, September, quince paste, October, apple and ginger, October. She picked up the quince paste jar and looked at it. Made in October. Her grandmother had been ill by October, had been ill since late summer, the illness that had moved quickly and taken her in August. Which meant Nora held the jar and thought about this, which meant someone else had made these jars. The neighbor, perhaps, or her grandmother had made them before August, before the illness had made making things impossible. She could not know which. She set the jar back on the shelf. She stood before the open preserving cupboard and looked at the rows of jars. All the work in them, the picking and the preparing and the slow cooking and the potting and the labeling. The year's produce put down for the winter as it had been put down every year. As though this were any winter and there would be someone here to open the jars through January and February and March. There would be. She was here. She would open the jars. She would eat the quince paste and the apple and ginger and the blackberry jam, and she would be doing exactly what the jars had been made for, exactly what they had been waiting for. She explored the kitchen equipment with the same attention. The pans on the rail below the shelves, she lifted each one, turned it over, looked at the bottom. The darkening of long use, not burnt, not damaged, simply the patina of pans that had been on this range for decades. The heavy-bottomed one she had used for her supper on the first evening. The stock pot, very large, the kind you used when you were cooking for many people or when you were making something that needed a lot of water and a lot of time. Her grandmother had made stock on Sundays. A smell Nora associated entirely with this kitchen, the long, savory smell of bones and vegetables simmering through the morning. The cast iron casserole on the lower shelf, she lifted it heavy, the weight of good iron. The chicken dish, she was certain of it, the casserole was the right shape and the right size, and the lid had the particular knob she had always watched her grandmother lift. The casserole in which the chicken dish had been made more times than she could count, in which the smell of it had filled this kitchen on so many evenings. She held the casserole with both hands and looked at it. She thought about asking for the recipe. She had thought about asking for years, had told herself many times that the next visit she would ask her grandmother to show her, to write it down, to teach her properly, and had not asked, had always been distracted by something else, or had assumed there would be another visit, another opportunity, another time. She set the casserole back on the shelf. She thought, "It will be in the notebook." She went into the garden at mid-morning. The December day had arrived, not bright, the sky a pale grey, but the Cotswolds light doing what it did, even in overcast December. The honeystone of the cottage walls and the garden walls catching it and giving it back as something warmer than it had been when it arrived. Her breath visible in the cold air. The frost still on the shadowed sections of the garden, the sections the winter sun had not yet reached. She walked the paths of the kitchen garden. Her grandmother had known every inch of this garden, had known the soil in each bed, and what it liked, and what it didn't, and what had grown well in it last year, and what should be moved. She had walked these paths every morning in the growing months, noting and deciding and doing. The garden in her hands the way the kitchen was in her hands, completely, naturally, without consulting anything. Nora walked the paths and looked. She knew enough about gardens to read the beds, the cleared ones, where this year's crops had been taken out and the soil turned for winter. The beds where the overwintering things were, the purple sprouting broccoli, small still but growing, the leeks in their row, the kale at the south-facing wall, things still producing in December, things her grandmother had put in knowing she would be here in winter to tend them. She stood at the south-facing wall, the kale very green against the honeystone, the large leaves dark and slightly frosted at the edges. She touched a leaf, cold, slightly rough, entirely alive. She thought, she planted this for winter. She thought, for whoever would be here in winter. She stood with this for a moment, the kale under her hand, the cold garden around her, the cottage behind her with the range going and the notebook on the worktop. Then she went back inside. She spent the middle of the day in the kitchen. Not cooking, she was not yet ready to cook. Simply being in the space while it was fully itself, the range going steadily, the December light coming through the east window and shifting slowly westward as the short day progressed, the kitchen warm and smelling of itself. She sat at the table with her lunch bread she had brought from London, the cheese she had remembered to pack, the apple from the Cotswolds village shop where she had stopped on the way. Simple things. She ate without hurry and looked at the kitchen around her and continued the noticing she had been doing since that morning. The drawer below the worktop. She opened it. The kitchen drawer, the proper kitchen drawer, the one beside the range, the one that held the things immediately required. A wooden spoon, she recognized the large one, the one her grandmother used for stirring things in the stock pot and for mixing the bread and for anything that required a spoon with some heft. The handle smooth and slightly darkened from years of use, the bowl of it stained with decades of cooking. She picked it up, the weight of it exactly right. She had not known she remembered the weight of it until she was holding it and found her hand entirely at home. The weight of a wooden spoon used so many times that the using of it had become part of what it was. She set it back in the drawer and continued through. The ladle, the slotted spoon, the fish slice, the pastry brush, its bristles slightly stiff but not ruined. The potato masher with the bent handle, she had seen that handle get bent, had been here When her grandmother used the masher too vigorously on a particularly resistant batch of potatoes and had simply noted the bend and continued, the bent handle never corrected because the masher still worked. She smiled at the bent handle. It was, she thought, the most her grandmother thing, the practical indifference to a fault that made no difference to the function. Not carelessness, simply the hierarchy of the useful over the perfect. She thought about all the small things she had absorbed from this kitchen without knowing she had absorbed them. The order of operations in a recipe, the things you prepared first, and the things that waited, and the timing of bringing different elements together. The knowledge of when something needed more time and when it was done not from a clock but from the smell and the sound and the look of it. The particular patience required for slow food. She had learned all of this here, in this kitchen, watching from the table, had carried it without knowing she was carrying it. Through 20 years of London cooking that was faster and simpler but built on a foundation she had not built herself. In the afternoon she went back to the worktop, to the 3 books stacked at the end of it. She looked at them with the attention she had been giving everything in the kitchen, not picking them up yet, simply looking. The large blue-spined cookbook she knew had seen her grandmother consult it occasionally, though she consulted it less and less as the years went on, relying more on her own knowledge and the notebook. She took it out and opened it. The pages used, some of them marked with the small signs of a well-used cookbook, a splash at one corner, a slight warping of the paper where it had been set down wet once. The margins occasionally annotated in her grandmother's handwriting, more salt and use the cast iron and better with double cream. The notes of someone who had made a recipe many times and had made it her own. She turned the pages slowly. Rabbit stew, the note in the margin, reading too long in the oven, reduced by 20 minutes. Shortbread, the note reading double the vanilla. No one ever complained. Victoria Sponge, the annotation reading, always seems wrong, but always tastes right. Leave it alone. She read these small notes with the particular attention she had been giving everything. Not recipes, not really. The record of a person cooking her way through a book over many years and marking what she had learned as she went. The conversation between the printed recipe and the person making it, annotated in the margins, the printed text and the handwritten response together, forming something neither alone would be. She set the blue book back and picked up the green one. Inside the front cover, the name, she could read it now, looking properly, a woman's name she didn't recognize, and below it, in her grandmother's handwriting, given to me on my 50th birthday and still my favorite for pastry. She opened the book to a random page. Pastry recipes, the pages more used than any others, more stained, the margins fuller. Her grandmother had made pastry often, had made it well. Nora remembered the short crust of pies and the puff of the vol au vents at Christmas and the sweet pastry of the tarts from the summer garden fruit. She set it beside the blue one and looked at the notebook. She picked it up for the first time. The weight of it more than she expected. The good paper, many pages filled. The cover worn at the corners, the cloth faded. She turned it over in her hands, no title, nothing on the cover, simply the cloth. The back cover as plain as the front. She carried it to the table. She sat in her chair and set the notebook on the table before her. The December afternoon light through the window lower now, the short Cotswolds day already well advanced, the range ticking, the kitchen warm and quiet around her. She opened the notebook. The first page, her grandmother's handwriting, the forward-leaning compressed script, a title, Recipes worth keeping. Nothing else on the page. Simply that the title and the premise behind it. The premise she had articulated to Nora more than once. A recipe worth making was a recipe worth recording. She turned to the second page. The first recipe. She read the title and felt something familiar move through her, not the chicken dish, something earlier. The porridge. The particular porridge her grandmother had made on winter mornings for as long as Nora had been having winter mornings here. The recipe written in the same handwriting, the proportions and the timing, and at the bottom a note. Soaked overnight is better, but not always possible. Adjust with patience and more water. She sat with this. The first recipe in the notebook, not a special occasion dish, not something impressive, the most ordinary thing, porridge. The thing made on the coldest mornings when coming downstairs to a warm kitchen and something hot was exactly what was needed. Her grandmother had put it first in the notebook. She thought, of course she did. She thought, she always started from the beginning. She read through the notebook slowly. The afternoon moving outside the December day very short, the light already going by 3:30, the kitchen shifting from afternoon light to the amber quality of early evening. She read and the range ticked and the cottage was quiet around her. The notebook was organized loosely by type. The breakfast things near the front porridge, the egg dishes, the griddle scones she had always made on Saturday mornings. Then the bread section, the Friday loaf, the soda bread for when there was no time to wait, the rolls she made at Christmas. Then soups, then the main dishes, then the puddings and cakes and the preserves. Each recipe in the same handwriting, the same unhurried script. Some with notes, the adjustments and improvements of many makings. Some very simple, just the recipe with no annotation. The recipes that had never needed changing because they were right the first time. The notebook was a record of her grandmother's judgment, as much as her grandmother's cooking the things that needed adjusting and the things that did not, the things done the way the book said and the things done her own way. She found the chicken dish. In the middle of the notebook, in the main dishes section, the title in the usual script, the ingredients listed, the method below. She read it carefully. The smoked paprika she had not known was in it. The lemon zest added at the end. The instruction to rest it for 15 minutes before serving her grandmother had always done this, had always said wait, always deflected Nora's impatience. Now she knew why. She sat with the recipe. Read it again, the ingredients, the method, the 2 small notes in the margin. Bay leaves from the garden are better. And below that, Nora always asks for this. She looked at this for a long time. Her name in her grandmother's handwriting, in the margin of the recipe, as a note to herself. Nora always asks for this. Written for no one else. Not as information for a reader, simply as the record of a fact. Nora always asks for this, and so it goes in the notebook. She thought, you knew I would find it, she thought. Or you hoped I would. She turned the pages forward. Through the puddings the apple crumble, naturally. The tree in the garden giving more apples than could be eaten fresh each year. The recipe with 2 small additions, penciled in beside the printed proportions, more cinnamon and a handful of oats in the crumble. Nora had always thought the crumble especially good. Now she knew why that was too. The Christmas cake, a long recipe, the most annotated in the book, the margins filled with the record of many Christmases, many adjustments. Made in October, the note said at the top, always made in October, allowed to mature. The feeding schedule in the margin, 3 tablespoons of brandy, every 2 weeks until December. Nora had been present for some of these feedings, had watched her grandmother unwrap the cake from its paper and apply the brandy with the particular solemnity of someone performing a procedure that mattered. She turned more pages, the notebook thinning as she approached the back, the recipes becoming more occasional, made rarely, and therefore recorded carefully. Marmalade, which was made once a year in January when the Seville oranges arrived. The cold cure soup, which was only made when someone was ill. The honey cake, made for special occasions. She was near the back of the notebook. She could feel it, the pages behind her right thumb, much fewer than the pages behind her left. She was almost at the end. And then there would be the blank pages that were always at the back of a notebook, in use, the pages not yet written on, waiting. She turned another page. A recipe she recognized from childhood, the gingerbread her grandmother had made at Christmas. The one cut into shapes and hung on the tree. She read it through. The treacle and the ginger and the cinnamon and the cloves. The instruction to leave it overnight in the tin before cutting. She remembered being told this as a child. The impatience, the waiting. She turned the page. She expected the blank pages. She did not find blank pages. There was one more recipe. Written in the same handwriting, the same script she had been reading all afternoon, but written differently from the others. She could see this before she had read a word of it, the ink fresher than the surrounding pages, the paper very slightly crisper, written more recently than everything that surrounded it. She looked at the top of the page. A date, the 3rd of December. She looked at the date and looked away. She looked at the kitchen around her, the range, the table, the window with the December garden in the last of the afternoon light. The evening coming in over the stone wall at the bottom of the garden, the holly berries very red. She looked back at the page, the 3rd of December, today, and below the date, in her grandmother's handwriting, her name. For Nora. She set the notebook down on the table. She did not read the recipe, not yet. She sat with her hands flat on the table on either side of the notebook and looked at the page, at the date, and at her name, and at the recipe below them, the writing she had not yet read. The kitchen very quiet around her, the range ticking, the December evening settling over the cottage, over the garden, over the village and the fields and the whole Cotswolds landscape beyond. The clock in the sitting room counting. She thought, "You knew I would come today." She thought, "How did you know I would come today?" She sat with the notebook open before her and the questions she could not answer, and the December dark arriving outside, and the warmth of the range and the kitchen entirely itself around her. She thought, "I am not ready to read it tonight." She thought, "Tomorrow." She closed the notebook gently, set it back on the worktop where it had always been, in its place between the blue cookbook and the green one, exactly where she had found it, exactly as it had been. She lit the lamp. She made her supper. She ate at the table in the lamplight, with the notebook on the worktop behind her, the date and her name inside it, the recipe she had not yet read. After supper, she sat for a long time with her tea, not looking at the notebook, simply sitting with the knowledge of it. The date, her name, the recipe written for her by someone who had known she would be here. She thought about all the ways her grandmother had known things, had known, somehow, what was needed before it was asked for, had known when Nora was unhappy before Nora had said so, had known the right thing to do in the kitchen long before she needed to think about it, had known through the accumulation of doing it right for so many years that the knowing was in her hands rather than her head. She thought, perhaps she simply knew me, she thought. Perhaps she knew me well enough to know that eventually I would come. That December would bring me here. That this would be when I arrived, when I was ready to arrive, which was also when I needed to. She went to bed with this. Her old room, the quilt, the window with the field white in the dark, the clock below, the range. She thought about tomorrow, about coming downstairs and sitting at the table and opening the notebook to the last page and reading what her grandmother had written for her, the date and her name and the recipe below them. She closed her eyes. Outside, the December night held the village and the fields and the stone walls and the bare trees very still in the cold. The notebook on the worktop with its last page, patient, as it had always been. She did not go to the notebook first thing. She had thought she would have fallen asleep the previous night with the intention of coming downstairs and sitting at the table and reading the last page before she had done anything else. But when she came down in the morning and the kitchen was cold and dark and the range needed lighting and the kettle needed filling, the ordinary requirements of the morning came first, as the ordinary requirements of a morning always did. She lit the range. She filled the kettle and put it on. She stood at the east window while it heated, the December morning arriving very slowly, the sky not yet light, the garden visible only as shapes, the frost on the field beyond the wall white in the dark. She watched the garden come visible as the morning arrived, the way it came visible every morning gradually, the shapes becoming more particular, the frost becoming the particular silver white of December frost, rather than simply paleness, the apple tree's branches separating from the sky. She made her porridge. The recipe in the notebook, the first recipe, the one she had read yesterday, the porridge with its instruction to soak overnight and its note about patience and more water. She had soaked the oats before bed. She made the porridge now from the recipe she had read and found that it was better than the porridge she had been making in London for 20 years, richer, smoother, the overnight soaking doing what the recipe said it would do. She sat at the table and ate the porridge and looked at the notebook on the worktop. It had been there all night, was there now, with its last page and its date and her name and the recipe she had not read. She finished the porridge. She washed the bowl. She poured her second cup of tea and carried it to the table. She sat down. She reached for the notebook. She opened it to the last page. The page as she had left it, the date at the top, the 3rd of December. Her name below it, for Nora, and below her name, the recipe. She read the title first. The bread. Not the ordinary Friday bread she knew that one was elsewhere in the notebook, had passed it yesterday. This was something called the winter loaf, a name she had not heard before. She read the title again. The winter loaf. Below the title, in brackets, in her grandmother's handwriting, the bread for cold mornings, for the first weeks of December, for the beginning of the dark. She read the recipe. It began as bread recipes began: the flour, the yeast, the water at the right temperature. But then the additions, the rosemary from the garden, very finely chopped, the walnuts, roughly broken, the honey, a tablespoon of the dark kind, not the pale, and the dried fruit, the cranberries, she had not expected. She read it through to the end. The method, the mixing and the first rise and the shaping and the second rise and the baking. The instruction to score the top of the loaf with 3 cuts before baking. And beside this instruction, A small note, 3 for the Decembers, which she did not understand. The final instruction, eat warm with good butter, with someone you love if possible, alone if necessary. The point being the eating. She sat with the recipe for a long time, the range ticking. The December morning outside, the light fully arrived now, the Cotswolds landscape, visible through the window, the garden, the field, the distant line of the Cotswolds escarpment against the pale grey sky. She thought about the bread. She had never seen it made, had never heard it called the winter loaf, had never been offered it on any visit, which meant it was not a recipe from her own experience of this kitchen. It was something her grandmother had kept from her, not hidden, not secret, but kept. Kept for December, kept for when it was needed, kept perhaps for this. She looked at the date, the 3rd of December. She had arrived on the 3rd of December entirely by accident, or not by accident exactly, but without planning the date. The hire car had been available. Her schedule had allowed it. She had chosen the 3rd without particular reason. She had not thought about the date, had not considered it in relation to anything except the length of the drive and the arrival of December itself. She thought, "How did you know?" The question she had been carrying since she first saw the date. How had her grandmother known she would be here on the 3rd of December? She looked at the page again. The ink fresher than the rest of the notebook. She had noticed this yesterday. She looked at it more carefully now in the morning light. Fresher, yes, but not very fresh. Not written recently. Written perhaps a year ago, perhaps longer. The ink not new, but not as aged as the recipes around it. She thought, "You did not write this in August?" She thought, "You wrote it before the illness." She turned back through the notebook slowly, not reading, simply looking at the pages, at the ink, at the freshness or age of the handwriting on each. The early recipes, old ink, the writing of 30 or 40 years ago, the ink slightly brownish at the edges. The later recipes fresher, but still aged. And the last page somewhere in between. She went back to the last page. She read the date again, the 3rd of December. And then she understood, or began to. She went to the study. Her grandmother's desk by the window, the papers in their orderly piles, the pen in the holder, the map on the wall. She went to the small calendar on the edge of the desk, a desk calendar, the kind that showed 1 month at a time, still showing this year's December. She looked at the 3rd, nothing written on it. She went through the desk drawer, the ordered contents of a person who kept their desk as their kitchen, everything in its place, everything for a purpose. Envelopes, stamps, the address book, a pen, a pencil, and at the back of the drawer, a small diary, not this year's, last year's. She opened it. She turned to the 3rd of December. The entry was brief, her grandmother's handwriting, the same script. Wrote the last page for N today. Bread recipe. Hope she comes in December someday. Always meant to make the winter loaf with her. Nora read this 3 times. She stood at the study desk with the small diary in her hands and read the entry on the 3rd of December of the previous year. Last December, 8 months before her grandmother died. Her grandmother had been well in December last year, had still been entirely herself, had still been making the bread and tending the garden and walking the penciled routes on the Cotswolds map. She had written the last page then, had chosen a date, not a specific date, she now understood, not a prediction. Her grandmother had not known she would come on the 3rd of December. She had simply written a December date, a date she liked, perhaps, or chose for no reason, or chose because the winter loaf was a recipe for the first weeks of December and any first week's date would do, and had put it in the notebook on the page after the gingerbread and left it there. And Nora had come on the 3rd of December. By accident, or not by accident, or by the particular coincidence that was not coincidence, exactly the kind that arrived when two things that had been moving toward each other for a long time finally met. She closed the diary. She put it back in the drawer. She went back to the kitchen. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, the notebook on the worktop, the range going, the December morning outside the east window. She thought about her grandmother in December last year, standing at this worktop, this exact worktop, in this exact kitchen, and writing the last page of the notebook, choosing a December date, writing for Nora and the recipe for the winter loaf and the note about the 3 cuts for the Decembers, writing with the knowledge that she was well now, but might not always be, that the notebook would outlast her, that Nora would come here eventually and find it. She had hoped she would come in December, always meant to make the winter loaf with her. She stood in the kitchen doorway with this and let it be what it was, not the mystery she had thought it was, not supernatural knowledge or impossible foresight. Simply the love of someone who had planned carefully for the people they loved, who had put things in order the way they put everything in order, who had written a recipe on a December date and hoped that someday a December would bring Nora here to find it. One December had. She went to the preserving cupboard. She needed to know what was available, what the kitchen held that she could use for the bread. The recipe called for walnuts, for cranberries, for honey. She looked through the cupboard shelves. Walnuts in a jar on the second shelf, labeled in the usual script. She lifted the jar and shook it. Enough? Cranberries. She did not find them in the preserving cupboard. She went through the other shelves, the tins. In the tin labeled baking, she found them dried cranberries in a small bag, labeled in her grandmother's writing with the year. Put away in the baking tin with the currants and the sultanas and the mixed peel, stored where they would be found by someone who baked, by someone looking for what they needed. Honey. On the shelf by the window, 2 jars of honey from the farm at the end of the lane. The dark honey, exactly as the recipe specified. She picked up one of the jars and held it to the window. The honey very dark in the winter light, amber going to brown, the color of something richly made. She put it on the table beside the notebook. The flower in the tin on the shelf, the label flower in the forward-leaning script. She opened it. Full, recently filled, or the tin sealed tightly enough to keep it fresh through the months. She pushed her hand into the flower and felt it the right texture, the dry silkiness of good flour, not damp, not stale. She found the rosemary bush outside the kitchen door. She had seen it that morning from the east window, the rosemary still green in the frost, the one herb that did not succumb to December. She went to the kitchen door and opened it and stepped out into the cold. The rosemary bush immediately in front of her, she could smell it before she touched it, the cold air carrying the resinous smell of it. She took a small branch, brought it inside, closed the door. She stood at the worktop with what she had gathered. The flour, the honey, the walnuts, the cranberries, the rosemary, everything the recipe required. Everything here, in this kitchen, either put away by her grandmother or grown in her garden. She was not going to make the bread today. She understood this as she looked at the ingredients on the worktop. The recipe required time, the overnight preparation, the long rise, the patience the notebook had always asked for. Today was for reading the recipe properly, for understanding it, for getting everything ready. Tomorrow was for making it. She went back to the table and opened the notebook to the last page. She read it again slowly this time, not the urgent reading of someone encountering something unexpected, but the careful reading of someone learning something they intended to do. The reading she had spent 20 years doing with other people's manuscripts, now brought to bear on her grandmother's handwriting and the recipe for the bread she had always meant to teach and had not. She read every word. The flour and the proportions and the yeast measurement and the water temperature, the rosemary very finely chopped, not roughly, very finely, the note emphasized. The walnuts roughly broken, the opposite instruction, rough, not fine, the texture of them part of the point. The honey dissolved in the water before adding. She had not done this before, had always added honey directly. The dissolving would make the difference in the dough. The 3 cuts on the top of the loaf, 3 for the Decembers. She read this again and thought about it. Not the Decembers she had spent here as a child, there had been many of those. Something else. She turned the question over in her mind and did not immediately find an answer and set it aside. Not everything needed answering immediately. The final instruction: eat warm with good butter, with someone you love if possible, alone if necessary, the point being the eating. She thought about this instruction. She would eat it alone. She was alone here in this cottage, and that was all right. The instruction acknowledged this. Had been written by someone who knew that sometimes you ate alone and that eating alone did not make the food less worth making. The point being the eating. The point being the sitting at the table in this kitchen and cutting into a loaf she had made with her own hands from this recipe and eating it with the butter from the village shop. In the afternoon she went to find the neighbor. She had been meaning to, had thought about it since arriving, had told herself she should. The woman who had been tending the cottage since August, who had oiled the lock and cleared the path and stacked the logs. She went to the village and asked at the shop, which was where you asked such things, and was given a name and a direction: the stone house at the end of the high street, the blue door. The woman was called Margaret. She was perhaps 70, with the particular quality of a Cotswolds village woman who had lived in the village all her life and had the village entirely in her knowledge of its families and histories and the way it worked and what it needed and who needed what. She looked at Nora with the clear-eyed recognition of someone who had known she was coming before she arrived, which she had the solicitor had written to her, apparently to say that the granddaughter would be coming in December. Margaret made her tea. Nora thanked her for everything: the path, the logs, the oiled lock, the garden cut back. Margaret made the particular gesture of someone who had done what was needed and did not require thanks for it. Nora said, "Did you make the preserves in the cupboard?" Margaret looked at her. She said, "No, those were hers. She made them this summer, June, July, before she became too ill to manage. She was very particular about getting the preserves done. I offered to help, and she said she'd rather do them herself while she could." Nora sat with this. Her grandmother in June and July, already knowing the illness was serious, choosing to spend her remaining good days making the blackberry jam and the quince paste and the apple and ginger, making them so that the cupboard would be full, so that whoever came to the cottage in winter would find the shelves full. She asked, "Did she say anything about December? About someone coming in December?" Margaret looked at her with the careful look of someone deciding how much to say. She said she thought her granddaughter would come when she was ready. She said December was a good time to come. She said the cottage was at its best in winter. She said she was very certain about it. Nora walked back to the cottage in the afternoon. The December afternoon already declining, the light going, the honeystone of the village buildings shifting from gold to the deeper amber of dusk. Her breath visible, the lane very still. She thought about what Margaret had said. December was a good time to come. She was very certain about it. She thought about her grandmother making the preserves in June and July, the cupboard full for winter, writing the last page of the notebook in December last year, kale in the garden for whoever would tend it in winter, the lock oiled, the path cleared, the logs stacked. Not prediction, simply preparation, the preparation of someone who knew that the people they loved would come eventually and wanted things to be ready when they did. Who had spent 40 years in this cottage making things ready and saw no reason to stop. She turned into the track and saw the cottage at the end of it, the last of the December light on the honeystone, the warmest amber of the day, the stone almost glowing, the chimney with the smoke of the range rising from it, straight in the still air, the 2 windows lit. She had left the kitchen lamp on when she went out, and the warm amber of it was visible through the glass from here. She stopped on the track and looked at it. The cottage lit from within, the smoke rising, the December dark coming in around it from the fields and the hedgerows. The cottage as it had looked on 1,000 evenings when she had come back to it from a walk or an errand in the village, her grandmother inside, the kitchen warm. She thought, it looks like someone is home. She thought, someone is. She soaked the oats for the next morning's porridge when she got in. Then she sat at the kitchen table with the notebook and read the bread recipe again, the 3rd reading, this time properly preparatory, the reading of someone who would be making this tomorrow. She understood it better with each reading, the proportions making more sense, the instructions clearer, the particular moments the recipe asked for attention, the water temperature, the feel of the dough after the first kneading, the way the dough should look before it went in for the first rise. Her grandmother had written these markers precisely, not vague instructions, specific ones, the instructions of someone who had made this bread many times and knew exactly what it needed and at which moment. She copied the recipe into her own notebook. She had not brought a notebook, had brought the 12 books she had not read and nothing to write in. But she found a pad of paper in the study drawer, the kind her grandmother had used for shopping lists, and she sat at the kitchen table and copied the recipe from the notebook in her grandmother's handwriting onto the shopping list paper in her own. She wrote it carefully, not transcribing copying, which was different. The act of writing the recipe in her own hand was the act of receiving it, she thought, of making it pass from her grandmother's hand through the notebook and the years and into her own, the recipe now in 2 hands, in her grandmother's forward-leaning script in the notebook, and in her own slightly larger, less certain hand on the shopping list paper. She wrote 3 for the Decembers and thought about it while she wrote it. 3 cuts, 3 Decembers. She turned over the possibilities. 3 months of winter, 3 weeks until Christmas. 3 years since she had come, but she had come 4 years ago, not 3. 3 generations, her grandmother, her mother, herself. She did not know. The phrase had the quality of a private notation, the kind that meant something to the person who wrote it and would require asking to understand. She could not ask. She wrote the phrase down anyway. 3 for the Decembers. She would not know what it meant, and that would be all right. Some things were worth keeping, even without knowing their full meaning. The notebook was full of such things. The recipe itself was one of them, made for 40 years in this kitchen, without Nora ever knowing it existed. After supper, she did something she had not done since arriving. She got the tin from the preserving cupboard, the Christmas cake tin, the one labelled in the usual handwriting. She took it to the table and lifted the lid. The Christmas cake, made in October, it said so in the recipe in the notebook, always made in October, allowed to mature. Dark, dense, the smell of it immediate and entirely itself, the brandy and the fruit and the spice of a properly kept Christmas cake, the paper wrapping intact, the cake beneath it. She unwrapped it carefully. A small Christmas cake, not large, the size made for a household of one or two. The top scored in the way her grandmother had always scored her cakes, a diamond pattern with a fork before baking, the marks baked into the dark surface. The cake solid and perfectly kept, the brandy having done its preserving work through October and November. She wrapped it again and put it back in the tin. It was not for tonight. The Christmas cake was for Christmas, for the proper time, for the days it had been made for. She had not been planning to be here at Christmas, and had not yet thought about whether she would be. But the cake was here, and it was made, and it was waiting. She thought, she made it for someone. She thought about her grandmother in October, still well enough then, still in the kitchen, still making the October cake as she had made it every October, making it not knowing who would eat it or when, but making it because it was October, and that was when you made the Christmas cake, making it for whoever would be here at Christmas. She thought, I might be here at Christmas. She had not thought this before arriving, had thought of this week as a single week, a beginning and an end, had not thought past it. But sitting in the warm kitchen with the Christmas cake in its tin and the bread recipe on the shopping list paper and the notebook on the worktop, she thought it now. She thought, I might stay. Not forever, she was not thinking about forever. Simply through December, through the making of the bread and the eating of the Christmas cake and the Christmases and whatever came after them. Through the period the winter loaf was made for the beginning of the dark. She thought, I am not ready to leave. She sat with this in the lamplight, the range going, the clock in the sitting room, the notebook on the worktop with its last page, the shopping list paper with the recipe in her own hand beside it. She got up and went to the worktop. She took the flour tin and measured out the flour for the bread. She covered the bowl with a cloth. She measured the oats for the morning and soaked them. She laid everything out that would be needed, the bowl, the measuring things, the rosemary she had brought in from the garden, the walnuts, the cranberries. Everything ready. Everything for tomorrow. Then she went to bed. Her old room, the quilt, the frost on the field, the clock, the range. She thought about the bread, about the dough and the rising and the shaping and the 3 cuts, about sitting at the kitchen table tomorrow afternoon with a warm loaf and butter from the village shop, about the particular experience of eating something made with your own hands from someone else's recipe, the recipe passing from one person to the next through the act of making it. She thought about her grandmother, about the December last year when she had stood at this worktop and written the last page, about what she had thought while she wrote it, whether she had thought about Nora specifically, or had simply written for the granddaughter she knew would come, the person she had known long enough to know that December would eventually bring her here. She thought, you knew me, she thought. You knew me well enough to leave the right things in the right places. The preserves and the kale and the Christmas cake and the recipe, the things I would need in the order I would need them, waiting for whenever I arrived. Outside the December night, very still, the Cotswolds landscape in its winter dark, patient, cold, the stone of the walls holding whatever warmth the day had given them. The cottage among the other cottages of the village, its range banked, its lamp still on in the kitchen below where she had forgotten to turn it off. The amber glow of it visible from the lane, she thought. The cottage lit from within. Someone home. She woke before it was light. The clock, the range, the particular silence of the Cotswolds before dawn, the landscape settled into its December cold, not yet done with the night. The patchwork quilt warm around her, the window showing the garden as shapes, the frost on the field a faint white in the dark. She thought about the bread. Not anxiously, she had not lain awake with anxiety about it, simply with the clear awareness of someone who had something to do and was ready to do it. The ingredients on the worktop where she had arranged them last night, the recipe in her own hand on the shopping list paper, propped against the blue cookbook where she could see it, the rosemary on the board, the walnuts in the wooden bowl, the cranberries measured out, the dark honey standing ready in its jar. Everything prepared, everything waiting. She got up and dressed in the cold of the room and went downstairs. The kitchen in the dark before dawn, the range holding warmth but needing feeding, the stone floor cold through her socks, the east window showing nothing yet. She dealt with the range, the ash, the kindling, the coal, the damper, the procedure coming naturally now, her hands knowing the order of it. The fire catching on the first attempt this morning, the range warmer than it had been, easier to bring back. 3 days had made the difference. 3 days of keeping it going, and it had come to expect continuation. The kettle, the porridge, the soaked oats from last night, the milk, the pinch of salt. She stood at the east window while she stirred and watched the December pre-dawn begin its slow announcement of itself. The sky above the garden, not yet showing colour, but the quality of the darkness changing the absolute black of deep night, becoming a slightly less absolute dark, the shapes of things in the garden beginning to separate from the general darkness. The apple tree, the rosemary bush, the stone wall at the boundary, the frost on the field beyond it very white. She ate her porridge at the table and looked at the ingredients on the worktop. The bowl of flour covered with its cloth measured out last night, the preparation she had done before going to bed, the first step taken so that this morning she would not have to begin entirely from nothing. Her grandmother had done this, she thought, had prepared the night before, had laid things out so that the morning began from a place of readiness rather than from nothing. The same instinct carried. She washed her bowl and dried her hands and went to the worktop. She looked at the recipe. She read it once more, not because she did not know it, but as a kind of beginning, the reading that was also the crossing of the threshold between thinking about the bread and making it. She began. The water first warm, not hot. The recipe clear about this. She tested it with her wrist, as she had seen done here for as long as she could remember, the inside of the wrist more sensitive than the palm, better at reading the particular warmth that was right and not the warmth that was too much. She had seen this gesture in this kitchen and had absorbed it without knowing she had absorbed it, and now found her wrist going to the water as though she had been doing it for years. The yeast went in, then the honey, the tablespoon of dark honey measured carefully, the spoon lifting from the jar trailing its thin amber thread, the honey going into the warm water and spreading in slow brown tendrils before dissolving. She stirred until it was dissolved and set the bowl on the worktop and looked at it. The surface very still, the yeast not yet visible. She chopped the rosemary. Very finely the recipe had emphasized this with the word very, the emphasis important, the fineness part of what the bread was. She chopped and then chopped again, the knife going through the small leaves repeatedly until they were almost a paste in places. The smell of it immediate and entirely itself, the cold morning kitchen filling with the green resinous smell of fresh rosemary, the garden smell, the smell of the bush outside the kitchen door that she had cut from yesterday morning while the frost was still on its leaves. She stood with the knife for a moment and breathed it. The smell of rosemary in the December morning, entirely the right smell for this moment, for this kitchen, for this bread. She broke the walnuts. Roughly, the recipe was precise about this, the opposite instruction from the rosemary. Not fine, not ground, rough, the texture of the walnut pieces part of the bread's texture, the contrast with the fineness of the rosemary intentional. She broke them with the back of a spoon in the wooden bowl, the nuts splitting into pieces of various sizes. Some very small, caught by the edge of the spoon, some larger, quarters of walnut, none of them uniform. The roughness itself, the point, the yeast bowl. She checked it, the surface was doing what the surface needed to do, the first faint activity visible. She watched it for a moment. The small signs of life in the warm liquid, the beginning of something that would eventually make the bread rise and lighten and become what the bread was supposed to be. She lifted the cloth from the flour bowl and made the well. The circular depression pressed into the flour, the action her hands remembered from watching and helping. The well deep enough to hold the liquid without it breaching the flour walls. She poured the yeast water carefully into the well, not too fast, the recipe had said. The flour wall needed to hold long enough for the mixing to happen in a controlled way. The liquid going in slowly, the flour beginning to absorb it at the edges. She mixed with her hands. The dough came together slowly. At first, a rough, shaggy mass, floury in some places, wet in others, not yet coherent, the ingredients mixed but not yet combined into anything with a single character. She worked it, pressed and turned and folded, the flour incorporating, the mass becoming more consistent, less various. The particular work of bread making, the work that required patience rather than speed, attention rather than force. She moved to the worn patch of the worktop. She had noticed it yesterday, the slight depression in the wood where decades of kneading had smoothed the surface differently from the surrounding area. The record of her grandmother's bread making in the worktop itself. She positioned herself in front of it and put the dough on it and began to knead properly, the heel of the hand, pressing down and forward, the fold back, the quarter turn, again. The dough under her hands becoming, with each pass, more itself. The December morning arrived while she kneaded. The east window lightening the sky, going from dark grey to the particular Cotswolds grey of a winter morning, the garden becoming visible in full, the frost on the field, very white, the kitchen warming from the range, the smell from the dough changing as it warmed under her hands, the yeast and the honey releasing their particular combination, the warmth of kneading drawing the smells out. She pressed 2 fingers into the dough, the indentation remaining not yet ready. She continued, the rhythm of it settling into her, the press and fold and turn and press, the dough becoming elastic, becoming smooth, the character of it changing from the rough beginnings to something more finished. She pressed again, slowly, partially, beginning to spring back. She continued 1 more minute and pressed again. The dough sprang back. She stopped and looked at it. Smooth, the surface whole and slightly shining, the grain of it close and even. She pressed with 1 finger, and the impression came back at her, the dough full of itself, ready for what came next. She had not known what ready felt like before this morning. She knew now. She added the inclusions. The rosemary first scattered over the surface of the dough, the fine dark green flecks. Then the walnuts, the rough pieces falling unevenly across the dough. Then the cranberries bright red against the pale dough, vivid in the December kitchen light. Then the honey, a second tablespoon drizzled over everything the recipes note. The honey added again at this stage to deepen the sweetness in the crumb. She folded the dough around the inclusions. The pressing and folding of incorporating working the additions through evenly without tearing the dough structure she had built. The rosemary disappearing into the body of the dough, visible only as dark green flecks in the cross-section when the dough tore slightly at the fold. The cranberries staying whole and bright, embedded. The walnuts in their rough pieces, resisting slightly, large enough to push through the dough rather than dissolve into it. The smell changed. The rosemary fully present now warming in the dough, mixing with the yeast and the honey to produce something that was not any one of them alone, but all of them together in the warmth of the kitchen. The particular smell of this bread, she had not known what it would smell like before making it. Now she knew, and she thought it was the right smell for December, the right smell for cold mornings and early dark and the warmth you made against them. She shaped the dough into a ball and placed it in the bowl and covered it. She set the bowl on the worktop near the range, the spot where the warmth was right, the spot the worn wood of the worktop suggested had been used for this purpose many times. The first rise, an hour, perhaps an hour and a half. She went out into the garden. The December morning had arrived fully. The low winter sun just clearing the Cotswolds escarpment to the east, its light coming in at a sharp angle and finding the frost on the field and the garden and the stone walls and making everything briefly brilliant. The particular brilliance of a frosty Cotswolds morning with winter sun, the honeystone of the cottage glowing, the frost catching the light, the bare trees with their shadows very long and very precise on the white ground below them. She walked the kitchen garden slowly, the frost crunching under her boots, the satisfying sound of it, the give and resistance of frozen ground, the kale at the south-facing wall very green, the frost on the broad leaves making them glitter. She touched a leaf cold and slightly rough and alive, the plant entirely indifferent to December, going on as it had been going on. She found the quince tree. She had noticed it before, but this morning she stood under it and looked up. A single fruit remained on one high branch overlooked in October, too high to reach easily, left hanging in the winter air. Yellow-green, very still, perfect in itself, the only remaining fruit of the year's harvest, kept by its own inaccessibility. She walked to the bottom of the garden. The stone wall with the holly hedge behind it, the berries very red, the leaves dark and glossy in the winter sun. She stood with her back to the wall and looked back at the cottage. The honeystone in the morning light, the chimney smoke rising straight in the still air. The east window with the kitchen just visible through the glass, the lamp still on, its amber light visible even in the daylight, a small warmth in the cold morning. She thought about her grandmother standing here, at the bottom of the garden, looking back. How many mornings, how many Decembers, standing in the frost with the cottage ahead, and the smoke rising, and the kitchen warm behind its glass. This was what she saw. This was what 40 years of mornings had looked like from this position. She thought, and now I am seeing it. She stood for a while with this and let the December morning be what it was, the cold and the frost and the low sun and the stone cottage, and the smoke, and the amber in the kitchen window, entirely itself, entirely enough. She went back inside. The dough had doubled. She could see it from the doorway, the cloth risen, the dough pressing up over the edges of the bowl, the first rise complete. She washed her hands and went to it and uncovered it. The smell of it strong now in the warm kitchen, the yeast having done its work, the dough alive with it. She turned it out onto the floured worktop. The pressure of deflating it, her hands pressing down, and the air releasing from the dough, the gentle give of it, the dough settling back into itself after its rising. This was the part she had watched as a child and not understood, had seen her grandmother press the risen dough down and had thought it seemed contrary, seemed to undo what the rising had done. She understood it now. The deflating was not undoing, it was preparing, resetting the structure for the final rise, which would be more controlled, more directed. She shaped the loaf, the oval folding and tucking the dough, pulling the surface taut from underneath, the technique the recipe described, and she had practiced in her mind a dozen times since reading it. Her first attempt not quite right, the tension not even one end tighter than the other. She went again, the dough cooperative, warm and alive under her hands. Better. The oval solid and reasonably taut, the surface smooth. Not her grandmother's shape, not the shape 40 years would make, the shape of hands that had done this hundreds of times and knew it completely. But good. Her own first shape, the beginning of something that would become better over many makings. She put it on the tin and covered it for the second rise. She set the oven to heat. She put the tin near the range. She sat at the table to wait. The dough under its cloth moved slightly as the minutes passed. Barely visible, the cloth lifting very slightly as the dough pressed upward. She watched it with the attention she had been giving everything in this kitchen since arriving. The particular attention that came from having nowhere else to be and nothing else required. She thought about the recipe, about the fact of it that it had been written down and kept, that it had survived in the notebook and come to her. She thought about all the recipes that had not been written down, the ones that had lived only in her grandmother's hands and that were gone now. There would be many of those, the things so habitual that writing them down had never seemed necessary, the things lost simply through the absence of the person who held them. And then the things that had been written down, the notebook recipes worth keeping, 40 years of decisions about what was worth preserving, what deserved the deliberate act of recording. Her grandmother's judgment across those 40 years, expressed in the handwriting on every page, and on the last page her judgment about Nora. What Nora would need, what Nora would want to be left. She had been right. She thought this simply and without sentiment. Her grandmother had been right about the bread and about everything else she had put in the notebook, and about the December, and about the kitchen being ready, and the preserves in the cupboard, and the kale in the garden. Right in the way that people were right when they had been paying close attention to the same things for a very long time. She checked the loaf. She lifted the cloth. The loaf had puffed, spread slightly, risen, the surface still smooth, but the shape looser, lighter, the air inside fully present. She pressed it gently with one finger, the soft remaining indentation of dough fully proved, ready. She picked up the knife. The 3 cuts, 3 for the Decembers still not fully understood, probably not to be fully understood, and that was all right. Some things passed between people carried, meaning that was not transferable in its entirety, only the mark of it, the gesture, the notation without its full explanation. She would make 3 cuts on every loaf she ever made from this recipe. That was enough. She made them diagonal, quick, confident. 3 cuts. The knife going through the proved surface cleanly, the dough beneath each cut pale and exposed. She put the tin in the oven. The smell began after 10 minutes. The suggestion of it first barely there, the first warmth of it, and then more present, building, the kitchen beginning to fill with the smell of bread baking. The honey and the rosemary and the yeast and the warmth of the oven all together, the particular smell of this bread that she now knew and had not known yesterday. She sat at the table and did not move. The smell moving through the kitchen and into the cottage, she could tell, sitting very still, that it was reaching the hallway and the sitting room, the warm bread smell going through the cold parts of the house, making itself felt everywhere. The cottage smelling of bread, smelling the way it had smelled on Friday mornings for 40 years. The same smell. This was the thing that struck her as she sat with it. The smell was the same. Exactly the same as the smell that had met her at the top of the stairs on childhood mornings when she had woken here and come down to the kitchen to find her grandmother at the range. The smell she had associated with this place and with being looked after. The smell that meant the Friday bread was in the oven and it was a good morning and everything was in order. The smell did not change when the hands that made the bread changed. She sat with this. The recipe the same, the kitchen the same, the range the same, the rosemary from the same garden and the smell the same, exactly the same, regardless of whose hands had mixed the dough. The bread was not in the hands, or the hands were not the only thing. The recipe was also in the bread. The kitchen was also in the bread. The 40 years of this smell in these walls was also in the bread. She thought about what it meant to make a thing from someone else's recipe, not to copy it, not to reproduce it, to make it, to take the recipe into your own hands and do what the recipe asked and find the thing coming out the same smell, the same taste, the same bread, not her grandmother's bread, her own bread made from her grandmother's recipe. The distinction important and also not important at all. The oven ticking, the range going, the smell filling everything. She checked at 30 minutes, tapped the bottom, not yet quite hollow. 5 more minutes. The top of the loaf visible when she opened the oven dark gold, the 3 cuts opened wide by the expansion of the oven, the marks she had made now 3 proper scores across the surface. She closed the door and waited. 5 minutes. She lifted the tin and tapped the bottom. Hollow. She put the loaf on the rack and stepped back and looked at it. The bread she had made. Slightly asymmetric in the shaping, the 3 cuts not as even as they might be, not the bread of 40 years of practice, but solid and brown and fragrant and entirely itself, the steam rising from it in the cold air above the rack. She got the butter and the bread knife and the board. She set them on the table and went back to stand before the loaf on the rack. The recipe had said at least 20 minutes. She waited the 20 minutes, standing at the range, not rushing, the bread cooling and settling, and the smell of it unchanged and strong. She carried the loaf to the board. She looked at it for a moment. Then she cut a slice the knife going through the crust with the right sound, the slight resistance and the give, the inside revealed. Pale and dense with its inclusions, the cranberries very red, the walnuts brown, the rosemary in dark green flecks throughout, the steam rising from the cut surface. She spread butter on the slice, the cold butter melting immediately into the warm bread going to liquid at the point of contact, spreading and softening, becoming part of the bread's surface. She ate it. The rosemary and the honey and the walnuts and the cranberries, the recipe exactly right, the combination exactly what it should be, the bread for cold mornings and the beginning of the dark exactly this. She cut another slice and ate it and sat in the kitchen in the December afternoon, entirely present in the bread and the moment and the kitchen. She thought about her grandmother tasting this bread for the first time. The first December she had made it, trying the combination she had imagined and finding it exactly right. The particular satisfaction of that, her grandmother had been right about many things she had tried had, Nora thought. The quality of good judgment that comes from paying close attention and being honest about what you find. From trying a thing and telling yourself plainly whether it was right or needed changing. The note in the margin of the chicken dish. Nora always asks for this. She would write her own note on the shopping list paper first time, December. The kitchen smelled of the bread all afternoon. Her own margin note. The beginning of a record. She made the chicken dish for supper. She had not planned this when she woke, had not thought past the bread. But the afternoon was long, and the kitchen was warm, and the casserole sat on its shelf, and the chicken was in the cold pantry, and the notebook was on the worktop, with the recipe on the page, with her name in the margin. She read it again the fourth or fifth time, the recipe that was not yet automatic. The smoked paprika measured into the small bowl. She had found it in the spice rack, exactly where the alphabet put it. She added it to the casserole, and the smell that rose was immediately and entirely the smell of the dish as she had always known it, the particular depth of it, the warmth of it, the thing that had been in the dish all along that she had never tasted as a separate element because it had always been part of the whole, the secret named at last. The bay leaves from the garden, the fresh ones, better than dried as the margin note had told her. She had cut them that morning from the small bay tree in the garden's sheltered corner, standing in the frost with the knife, the smell of the leaves sharp and green in the cold air, the garden providing what the kitchen needed, as the garden had always provided what the kitchen needed. The long, slow cooking, the covering and the low heat, and the not lifting the lid to check the patience required, the trust in the process. She had not always had this patience. She thought she was acquiring it. The kitchen was a good place to acquire it, a place where patience was not a virtue, but simply the correct approach, the thing the food required and rewarded. The lemon zest at the end, the recipe's final addition, the brightness at the end of a long, slow dish, the sharpness that cut through the richness. She zested the lemon over the casserole before replacing the lid for the resting period, the pale yellow curls falling in. The smell that came up the lemon and the paprika and the bay and the long cooking all together, entirely itself, entirely right. She set the timer, 15 minutes. She set the table while she waited. The mat, the plate, the glass of water, the knife and fork, the heavy old ones from the kitchen drawer, the ones she had been using for all her meals here. She put the breadboard on the table with the remaining winter loaf. She would eat the bread alongside the chicken, as she was certain it was meant to be eaten, though the recipe did not say so. She lit the lamp and turned off the main light. The kitchen shifting into its evening quality, the amber circle of the lamp and the rest of the room warm and shadowed, the range going steadily, the December dark outside the window complete now, the garden invisible, the frost on the field suggested but not seen. The timer. She served herself from the casserole, the smell of it immediate as she lifted the lid, the 15-minute rest having done what the recipe promised, the dish settled and complete. She sat at the table. She tasted the chicken dish. It was the chicken dish. Entirely, completely, the thing she had been eating since childhood, the dish she had requested at every visit without knowing what was in it, the thing that had always tasted exactly like itself and nothing else. The hands had changed and the dish had not. The recipe passing from one person to the next through the act of making it, arriving unchanged, exactly itself. She ate her supper slowly. The chicken dish and the bread and the December evening and the kitchen entirely warm around her. The lamp, the clock, the range. She thought about the recipe now being in her hands. In the literal sense, in the hands that had made it today and that would make it again. In the sense that mattered most. The notebook had given her the recipe, and she had made it, and it had become hers in the making. Not her grandmother's recipe that she was borrowing. Her recipe now received, made, carried. She washed up after supper with the particular satisfaction of someone washing up after cooking something well. The casserole cleaned and dried and put back on its shelf. The plate, the glass, the cutlery, the breadboard wiped, the bread knife dried and returned to the drawer. The proving tin from the bread making, the bowl, the measuring things, each one cleaned and returned to its place. She put everything back in its place. The kitchen exactly as it should be, at the end of a cooking day, clean and ordered, and ready for tomorrow. The way her grandmother had left it every evening of the 40 years she had lived here. Not a performance of tidiness, but simply the correct end of the day's work. The kitchen returned to its prepared state so that the next day could begin from readiness. She stood at the range for a moment, the heat from it on her face and hands. She banked it for the night, the right amount of coal, the damper position she had learned over 3 days of managing it, the range settling into its slower overnight burn. She went to the worktop. She picked up the notebook and opened it to the last page. For Nora, the date, the winter loaf. Eat warm with good butter, with someone you love if possible, alone if necessary, the point being the eating. 3 for the Decembers. She read it all the way through for the last time. The recipe she had made today, the instructions familiar now, the notes understood, the 3 cuts, still not fully explained and still all right. Some things were worth carrying without understanding them entirely. The phrase would mean something to her. Each December she made this bread, and that was meaning enough. She closed the notebook gently. She put it back between the 2 cookbooks, exactly where it had been, in its place. She sat at the table one more time before going up. The lamp, the range, the clock, the kitchen in its evening state, the amber circle and the warm shadows and the smell of the day still present in the room. Rosemary and honey and smoked paprika and the bread and the long cooking. The smell of a kitchen used well. She thought about staying. She had been moving toward this decision for 3 days since the first evening when she sat in this chair and thought, I am glad I came. Since the morning she had read the date on the last page, since the afternoon under the ash tree at Greymore. No, that was someone else's afternoon. Since the afternoon she had walked to the bottom of the garden and seen the cottage lit from within. Through December, through the Friday bread still to be made, the other recipes in the notebook still unread, the Christmas cake in the tin waiting for the right time, through the dark weeks and the short days and the cold mornings when porridge and a warm kitchen were exactly what was needed, her mother, perhaps, invited for Christmas, the table set with 2 of the mismatched chairs, the cake from October, whatever else the notebook taught her to make in the weeks between now and then. She would call the office tomorrow. She would arrange things. She had learned, over 3 days in this kitchen, that things could be arranged. that the practical world was manageable from a distance, that December did not require her in London in the way she had always assumed it required her. She thought, that would be enough. She thought, that would be exactly enough. She turned off the lamp, the kitchen in the dark, the range's faint glow, the window showing the garden and the frost, the notebook on the worktop, the bread under its cloth. She went upstairs, the old room, the patchwork quilt, the window with the frost on the field. She lay in the dark and listened the clock in the sitting room, the range below, the December night outside pressing very gently at the glass. She thought about tomorrow, the porridge soaked, the kitchen in the morning light, the notebook open to whatever came next. She thought about Friday and the ordinary bread. She thought about the Christmas cake in its tin and the weeks ahead, and her mother on the phone when she called tomorrow. She closed her eyes. The clock counted. The range held its warmth in the stone below. Outside the Cotswolds, December held everything very still, the honeystone village, the frost-white fields, the bare trees, the single quince on its branch in the dark. And in the kitchen below, the notebook on the worktop with its last page, the bread under its cloth, the smell of the day still in the walls and the stone and the air rosemary and honey and the warmth of a kitchen used the way it was made to be used. Her grandmother's kitchen, her kitchen now. The bread will be there in the morning. The notebook will be there. Sleep well,